Hello ladies, welcome back. Sorry about the coughing fit, which I've tried to explain on my link to the previous video. I'm not quite sure what's the matter with this one. Anyway, we'll try and finish this off. There's only a few slides left, I think. So, excuse me. Basically, we're going to take a look at the multiplier, which again you should be familiar with, but we'll just it's a bit of revision, but also hopefully explaining it in a bit more detail too. So basically, multiplier effect is if we're talking about an injection into the circular flow of income, a larger final increase in the level of national income or output will be generated by the multiplier effect. And we'll explain what that means in a minute. Hopefully it's a familiar concept to you. Let's look at an example which probably illustrates it better than anything. So if we assume that the government is going to inject £1 billion worth of funding into the education budget, that will improve teachers' pay and conditions, okay? So that's what they've decided they're going to do. Yes, we all shout. If that were the case, that would be an injection into the circular flow of income. Remember, injections and withdrawals into the circular flow of income, and that obviously would be a component of aggregate demand too. If you think about that, well, in this case, if we had that increase of £1 billion into the circular flow of income, we would expect the overall level of aggregate demand to also rise by that, at least that amount. If that were the case, then, thinking about how this process would work, teachers will probably spend some of that extra £1 billion on goods and services. And let's assume that we spend, as a group of individuals, we spend 80% of that initial injection, and that's going to effectively mean that consumption would rise by £800 million. However, thinking about this, that's going to stimulate further rounds of capital investment because firms will see that there is this new demand, and they will seek to increase their capacity. And as a result of that, that's going to create a further injection into the circular flow, and that again will boost aggregate demand again, as more spending goes on based on that initial level of spending. That clearly is going to be an increase. If we then think about the advantage to that, that's going to mean that more firms will decide to take on additional labour to meet the extra demand. That's going to cause more jobs to be created and new income for workers, and that clearly in lots of cases will also be spent on further consumption. So you can see this multiplier effect happening. So if we then take a look at how that might work, that initial injection of £1 billion worth of funding into the circular flow would be boosted by the total final aggregate demand by a significant amount more than that £1 billion in the longer term. Okay, let's look at how we might calculate the multiplier then. And there are a number of ways to do this. I think in this instance, there's only one that you need to understand, and this is the one that we'll actually explain here. Okay, so two things: we can actually try to calculate the value of the multiplier. Sometimes you might be given that value, and then obviously you can then assess what if there was an increase, an injection into the circular flow, what effect that would have in the overall run of things. Okay, so first things first, we need to look at what the initial, in order to calculate it, we need to look at the initial change in injections, and then also the resulting change in national income. So let's take a look at the formula that we would use to calculate that. It would basically be K equals change in Y divided by the change in J. You might think, what the hell does that mean? Well, let's just look at what each of those letters stand for. Okay, so that's where K is the multiplier, so the level of multiplier. The triangle is the change in this case, real income. So the change in real income divided by the change in injections. So let's take a look at an example. Okay, so if we had an injection where the government decided it was going to spend £500 million more on whatever it is, a new policy that involved in investing more, £500 million more in the economy, and that had a resulting change in real income, Y, of £2 billion, then to calculate the multiplier, what we would do is basically take the change in real income. So the change in this case, we will change the real income by 2 billion. So 2 billion divided by the original government spending increase of 500 billion leaves a multiplier of 4. So effectively, in this case, that's quite a high level of multiplier. In this case, that would mean that any investment would create a significant increase over time in the national income, and that's what the multiplier effect is all about. Okay, let's have a look at the situation where we might have a negative multiplier then. Okay, so in this case, if we had a cut in government spending, for instance, or welfare cuts, then clearly that might have an impact on the multiplier too, but maybe in a negative way. So clearly, if we have withdrawals from the economy, so we've talked about an injection into the economy with the government spending more money, but if we had a withdrawal from the economy, from the circular flow of income, then that could happen in reverse. And in some cases, that might be a good thing, particularly if the government is trying to control inflation, as an example, maybe using monetary but also fiscal policy where it's adjusting government spending and taxation. So, as we said here, if we got a cut in spending and an increase in taxes, that's going to lead to a negative multiplier and fall in GDP. Now, the size of the multiplier is very much dependent on a couple of things, okay? So if we think about the marginal propensity to consume, we talked about marginal cost, marginal revenue, etc., etc. Well, if we have a high marginal propensity to consume, if we then have an increase in investment of any description, or we have, in this case, teachers' salaries and conditions going up, like the example we just gave, well, if we have a high propensity to consume, that means that we're going to spend most of that extra money on consumption. And clearly, if we do that, then the multiplier, the effect of the multiplier is going to be more significant, because if any extra money that we get, we spend straight away on consumption, that's going to mean that the multiplier effect will have a more significant effect. So if we have a high level of a high propensity to consume, then that's going to feed through into a higher value for the multiplier. However, it may well be that even if we got this increase in terms and conditions, it may be that certain individuals choose to have a higher marginal propensity to save. So in that case, they would actually say, well, not feeling particularly confident, or that we might actually just hold on to the increase that we've received. And if we have a high marginal propensity to save, then clearly that's going to lead to a lower value of the multiplier, okay? And each individual is going to have a different view on, and that might be down to animal spirits and to how confident people feel, and also where they see, the future going, etc., etc. Okay, so let's take a look at things that can affect the size of the multiplier then, and some of the things you won't be a great surprise given what we've just talked about. So interest rates will clearly have an effect, okay? So if we've got high levels of interest rate, consumption's not going to be less significant, and as a result of that, any additional income might be saved rather than spent. Okay, interest rates are high. There's a greater incentive for people to save money. They'll get higher levels of interest, and also consumption is probably going to be slightly reduced by those higher interest rates, because in some instances, interest rates are going to affect major purchases. Well, not some, in all instances, interest rates are going to affect major purchases like houses and cars, so consumer items. Tax rates will also have an effect on the size of the multiplier. As we know, taxes are a withdrawal from the circular flow. So if we actually have a high level of tax rate, consumers are probably going to spend less, and they're going to have less disposable income. And as a result of that, that will affect the level of consumption, which in turn will affect the level of the multiplier. Imports will also have a significant effect on the multiplier. Now, clearly, we know that as we become richer and more wealthy and will require more choice in products and services, then we tend to have quite a high propensity to consume imports. As a result of that, if we do that, if we get increases in disposable income, but they're spent on imported goods, that essentially counts as a withdrawal from the circular flow of income, and national income wouldn't rise and consumption wouldn't rise in quite the same way. Although the consumption will rise, but it's not spent on goods and services from this country, and as a result, that would be seen as a withdrawal from the circular flow. If we have spare capacity, that clearly is going to have an effect. Okay, if we've got very little spare capacity, then any increase in demand is probably not going to be able to be met by firms. And that's certainly true in the short run, and effectively that might mean that the multiplier is going to be somewhat limited, and inflation may occur rather than an increase in consumption. Well, the increase in consumption will cause inflation rather than anything else. So a little bit of reading for you to do. It's quite a nice article, which if you click on the link here, you can go and take a look at, and this is talking about HS2, which is a massive infrastructure project, as I'm sure some of you will be familiar with. You might have studied it in geography too. But in this instance, I want you to take a look at what the economic benefits might be of that project, the multiplier effect, and the size of the multiplier effect, and also do you think this is a good use of government money, given the size and expense of the project? So it's one for you to weigh up. HS2 is a bit of a hot potato, so it wouldn't ever surprise me if any questions came up on a large infrastructure project like HS2 and the effects that it might have as far as these areas are concerned. So that's quite a nice article to take a look at. And it's one that you could use in a range of different questions, as you'll see. So just to sort of sum this up then, how is AD and AS, how does the AD and AS model shed light on the economy as a whole? Let's take a look at some of the things that it can demonstrate. Okay, what it does effectively is it allows us to look at a variety of macroeconomic variables. So one is obviously aggregate demand, which clearly is something that the government might try to stimulate in order to create economic growth. You can also see that we've looked at the impact on inflation. So where we've got price rises and price increases caused by us being near full capacity within the economy, but also levels of unemployment that might be created if aggregate demand is significantly below the overall capacity of the economy. But as we can see, it also links quite closely to other areas, like, for instance, if we looked at interest rate changes, okay, we can look at full capacity, we can look at economic growth, and also look at the trade cycle and a number of other things that might affect aggregate demand and aggregate supply, and then the impact of what the government might be able to do. So it might be able to change the levels of interest rates, so reduce interest rates and reduce taxation rates in order to stimulate aggregate demand. But it can also look at other policies like supply side policies and also monetary policies to control the money supply in order to try and keep this balance between a stable economic environment and trying to stimulate some form of growth. So it's clearly a pretty fundamental principle, and what you can do if you can get your head around the AD and AS model, it gives you lots of opportunities to explain and demonstrate just what a thinking economist you are. And if you can get this nailed, it will help in all sorts of different ways. And it is very much expected that you will be able to use AD and AS models to illustrate these factors. So it's one that's worth having a look at. There is quite a nice summary in the booklet too, which actually goes through step by step some of the things that we've talked about here. But I think that actually is quite a nice way to sort of round it up, really. So that's what we looked at. We looked at all of those areas. I do apologise for the slight breakup in transmission there, but that covers the chapter 12, and I'll catch up with you in the tutorial later on today. Thank you for listening.